So I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, and that's Julia Barton. And she is one of two educators at OFA. And if you're not familiar with OFA, I think she's going to talk a little bit about the organization. But if you have any interest in regenerative agriculture or transitioning to organic, this is an organization you need to become familiar with. And they do have a conference coming up next month. And
February.
It is a great place to be. So Julia has been with OFA since 2012, and she does have a small diversified farm herself. So, and she's a great help to farmers that are transitioning. And I am going to turn it over to her right now. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you, Cassie, and thanks for organizing the series in general. I think it's really valuable and really excited to have that happening this winter. And also thank you for including me. So I'm very happy to be here. I am going to go ahead and share my screen. So if you'll just bear with me here. Oh, and I see Cassie is sharing with us who all is here. So it looks like we have some farmers, some educators, and folks working with organic producers, and some folks considering organic production. So that's helpful to know. Good deal. So I will just get going here just a second. There we go. Okay, so today I will be sharing with you some questions that are frequently asked to me about organic transition. But before I do that, I just wanted to mention a little bit more about OFA. OFA was formed by farmers and eaters at a time when there were not many organizations available or institutions available to provide that sort of education or assistance. And now it has grown into a coalition, a grassroots coalition of people working together to build a sustainable food system that supports family farms and rural communities, provides safe and local food to consumers, and protects the environment. We would be happy to work with you in any number of ways. And one of the ways that I'm principally working with producers right now is supporting them in terms of considering organic production, whether or not it might be a good fit, and then also working with folks during that transition process. So in so doing, I get an awful lot of questions about transition, and we are going to go through the top 8 that I receive and 2 that I don't typically receive, but that I'd like to share the answers with you all anyway, because I think they could be potentially useful. So I'm just going to jump in so that we have plenty of time for questions and discussion. Cassie asked that if you all would pop questions into the chat. After each of these sections, we'll stop and take those questions, and then hopefully we'll have some more time for discussion towards the end. So in terms of getting started, that's the #1 question I get. What do I need to do? Is what people say. So in terms of getting started with transition, oh, look, Dave, there you are. You're right there on the screen. You need to build a relationship with a certifier for sure. And the reason that that makes sense is that you have a lot of options for certification, or the producers that you work with have a lot of options for certification. There are about 80 certifiers, many of whom work in our region, and all of them sort of have their own personalities and their own interpretations of things. So it's a good idea to, I'm just gonna move this out of the way here. It's a good idea to pick 1 or 2 and build a relationship and start thinking about where you might want to certify early in the process, because there might be some variations in what is accepted. We do, as certifiers, the certifiers try to all stay in touch with one another and make sure that they're on the same page, but there are some variations. So just in planning for that, kind of pick a certifier with a culture and a set of, a way of doing business, a way of serving people that works for you, and get to know them and work with them early on. Something that I think is really important is to find a mentor and find your community. And that is why Dave's picture is here on the screen. It's nice that he's also on the call. You know, when I needed to figure out how to clean out a combine for the first time, I had already written a policy about cleaning out a combine, but I had never done it myself. And so I called Dave and I said, okay, like, how do you actually go about doing this in real life? And it's really important to have people like that on your team that you can call and check in with. And these are a few of my mentors that you can see here, but everybody has their own for various things in their operations, and it's really important to connect with those folks. The OFA conference is a great place to do that connecting. If you're looking for other people doing organic production or in transition, if you want somebody to kind of walk alongside you, it's a good place to connect. The next thing to really do is study those organic standards, and we'll talk about a few ways to go about that. Develop a record keeping system and make a transition plan. Well, let me advance my slide here, Cassie. Not sure why. So strange.
You might try ending the show and restarting it. Sometimes computers just need a kick.
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna stop share and just, that's odd.
Yeah.
It's okay, everyone. I know this whole presentation by heart, so if we don't have the slides, we can still talk through it. Let me just freeze it on me. Okay, let's try it again. It's even freezing on the sharing. Here we go. Let's try again.
Hurrah.
Cool. We did test this, just so you all know. It worked great. Okay, now it's going. Okay, we'll just keep clicking through and hope that doesn't happen again. Okay, so when one is planning for transition, the most important thing to do first is to think about when that last prohibited date was. So when was the last date that a prohibited substance was applied to this land? That enables you to make a plan counting 36 months or 3 years out from that date and figuring what your rotation needs to be in the meantime, what all you need to get done in the meantime, what you want to come out with as that first certified organic crop. Or if you're working with livestock, when does the land transition and when does the herd transition, for instance, or when do you bring the animals onto the operation? So that's a really important thing to figure out. Sometimes you know that because you have been managing that land yourself during that time, and sometimes you don't, and you need to access prior land use information from a previous land owner or land manager. We have sample forms to document that prior land use information, so you don't need to reinvent the wheel on that. Be happy to share those with you. You also need to think about what's happening on neighboring land. So thinking about adjoining land use and buffers, whether or not those are needed, and think about what that organic system of management will look like. The primary kind of categories of setting up an organic system include cultural, mechanical, and biological controls. And hopefully you would have had some experience doing sustainable agriculture production prior to applying for organic certification or transitioning, but maybe transition is your experimentation period. And that's a really good time to work on getting that, that organic system in place. Mentors can help with that. We can help with resources for developing that at OFA. And I know OFFA is also a great resource that can be looked to for that sort of information. After figuring out what that organic system of management is, that's when we would think about approved inputs. So we're not looking at this as, what can I substitute for Roundup kind of a conversation. We're really looking at the system first and then thinking about what are those inputs that I'm going to need to supplement my system. And we have good ways of figuring out that information as well that I'll share shortly. Developing that record keeping system, you'll hear me say that a few times because it's really critical to third-party verification of what is happening on the ground. And then also determining the costs and benefits. So I will be the first to say that organic production is not for everyone. And we don't want to pretend that it is, but determining, when you're looking into transition or beginning along a transitional path, if that is a good fit, or if maybe there's some other sort of, place along that sustainable agriculture spectrum that's a better fit, is a good kind of conversation, honest conversation to have with oneself. The organic certification process is the same for every producer every year. So the folks that are on this call who have been certified for a number of years have been through this process annually. It begins with an organic system plan and a payment to the certifying agency for the service of organic certification. That organic system plan is a lot of work. And it's particularly a lot of work in that first year. So there's a lot of heavy lifting that will take place either during transition or during that very first organic system plan draft. After that point, because OFA's organic system plan is modular, it's really more of an experience of kind of reviewing and reevaluating the words on that page and making sure that they continue to represent the management that's going on. So it's not as bad after that first year to write that plan. That plan is submitted and undergoes a pre-inspection review by some of our certification staff. If all the information is present and ready to go, that can be moved right along to the inspection stage. The inspector will make an appointment with the producer. And if it can range, you know, if it's a small operation and things are fairly simple, it could maybe be a 2-hour inspection. If it's really complex and includes multiple scopes, you know, some handling operations, their inspections take 3 days. With an on-farm operation, I would say, you know, the longest it would probably be a full day if you had, say, crop, livestock, and handling and a lot of different moving parts. It's an annual inspection, so it's a big investment of time once a year, but it's not like it's happening every week. The inspector then submits a report back to the certification staff where it undergoes a post-inspection review by a staff member. And that person makes a certification decision, which is run up the flagpole and reviewed by a senior staff member to make sure everything is in order. At that point, if all is well, which we certainly hope that it is, it would then result in an organic certificate, after which point the crop or livestock product could be marketed as organic. Once an operation is certified in a certain scope for certain products, that certificate does not expire. So this process is an annual process that must occur each year, but there's not an expiration that occurs in the meantime. That certificate is good until the next certificate is issued. That makes sense. We at OFA view this process as a partnership, which includes producers and inspectors and certifiers certainly as the primary participants, but also educators and resource providers, you know, input dealers, veterinarians. There are all sorts of folks that can really make or break this by sharing accurate information and by supporting with appropriate documentation. So, you know, there's a way for all of us to kind of support the producers in the work that they're trying to do. And by doing our work accurately and in a timely fashion, things can go really well. Second question under this section is, how much does it cost? Which we would all need to know. One of the things that I really like about OFA's fee schedule is that you know upfront what your fees are. Not all certifiers operate that way. We certify our farm, and the certifier we work with has a different way of doing that. We pay a certain fee up front, and then we pay another fee after inspection, and then we pay a percentage of sales at the end of the season. I don't prefer that fee schedule. I like the way OFA does it, and I'll just outline that for you here. This is the region in which we work for OFA and the region in which I support transitioning producers also. I just got these fees hot off the presses because our new forms, our new certification plans or organic system plans and forms for this year will be out in the next couple of weeks. But these are the fees for 2021. There is also a cost share reimbursement program, which is part of the Farm Bill. So it is a federal program. It was a better reimbursement program than it currently is. And unfortunately, it changed in the middle of last growing season, as if we needed another change in the middle of last growing season. But this is how it currently stands now. So the upfront fee, say for a crop operation, if that application was turned in by March 15th, would be $1,100 in the state of Ohio, and it would be $1,150 if turned in by May 15th. So with a cost share reimbursement program of 50% up to $500 per scope, that would leave us with a cost of about $650 after reimbursement. Is everybody following that? Okay, so the livestock scope would be a flat fee of $400 as the upfront application fee on top of the land. So the land that the animals would graze or live upon would be part of that crop fee. And then you'd have the livestock scope. So you're looking at about $200 for that scope after reimbursement. So if I was certifying both crop and livestock and I got my, my application in by March 15th, which I always encourage transitioning producers to do because the timing of that first year of certification is really critical. Because one can only market one's product once that certificate is in hand. I would, you'd be looking at somewhere, you'd have that upfront fee of, what is that, $1,500, and you'd be looking at $850 after reimbursement. Does that make sense? The handling, on-farm handling, the fee is based on gross organic sales, and that would be for a first-year producer projected gross organic sales for that first year, which I realize can be difficult to calculate. I'd be happy to help someone try to figure that if there was help needed. The lowest fee of that on-farm handling fee scale is, I think, $250, and the uppermost fee would be in the $3,000 range. And again, you would do half of that up to $500 to calculate the cost share reimbursement. Cost share reimbursement can be applied for once that first organic certificate is achieved, and annually thereafter, so long as it is included in the Farm Bill. Okay.
Julia, can I ask a question quick?
Yes, please do. I can go back.
If you're certifying a livestock and a crop enterprise, does that sharing, that cost share, apply to both, or is that like a flat 500 per operation, period?
No, it's per scope.
Okay.
So the 50% up to $500 is per scope. So that's where that, if you look under the crop section there, we have roughly $650 after reimbursement. And under the livestock section, we'd be looking at roughly $200 after reimbursement with OFA's fees. And then for handling, we just can't calculate it because we don't know what our system is. But if it was like a beginning maple syrup operation, for instance, that was going to have $50,000 or less in organic sales this year, that would just be $250 to apply for that handling fee, which is very low for handling operations in the industry. I think OFA does a really nice job of taking into account on-farm handling and pricing accordingly. Other questions about this section? Have we got anything in the chat, Cassie, or does anybody have anything they want to ask?
There's nothing in the chat. If folks want to take themselves off mute and ask a question, you can do that by clicking the little microphone icon at the bottom of your screen or on your phone.
So during the transition process, what kind of help do you provide farmers going through that transition? Can you kind of go through like is there a mock certification process that you could pay for or something like that, just to make sure everything's squared away when it's time to, in year 3 when it's time to go?
Yes, we do have some specific transition services, and I will get into that a little bit later, but there is something, to answer your specific question, there is something that we call an on-farm readiness review, which is similar to a mock inspection. It's sort of somewhere between a consultation and an inspection. And I conduct those, as does my colleague, Eric Pulowski. We are both trained organic inspectors and both did that for several years before we worked as educators. And we would have you fill out an organic system plan ahead of time so that we could conduct that just as we would an inspection. And then we would kind of take on and off our inspector hat and also talk with you kind of as a consultant throughout. We used to run it really more strictly as a mock inspection, and what we found was that there was a need for a hybrid. So that's what we offer now. Yes.
Any other questions out there? All right, if you think of something, go ahead and pop it in the chat or hang on to it for the next question period here.
Okay, perfect. This next section is the nuts and bolts section, and it is pretty nutsy and boltsy. So just roll with me here, and then, like Cassie said, pop questions in the chat, and then we'll get to them here at the end. You might have a few things that pop up for you thinking about your own operation, and we should have plenty of time to discuss. Okay, so what inputs can I use is a question that I often get on the phone, and I want to just take us back to that concept of organic being a holistic system of production, and first thinking about those cultural, mechanical, and biological controls that would be part of that organic system plan. These would include practices which you may already be doing and not thinking about in the sense of them being part of that plan. Good practices like crop rotation and cover cropping. Cultivation and tillage, I know, can also be challenging with regard to soil health, but done in conservative ways can be beneficial and certainly are utilized in organic systems. Integrated pest management, the creation of pollinator habitat and other habitat, and the release of beneficial organisms are just a few examples. After you would have that good organic system plan management system in mind, that would be the point at which we would then be identifying inputs that would be approved. So we're not going to fall into the trap that they call input substitution, because it just doesn't work. When people call and ask, they want to burn down their cover crop and they want an organic product to burn down the cover crop because that was the way it was managed in the system they had been producing in previously, that would just not happen in an organic system. We're terminating in other ways, terminating through mechanical means or through grazing, for example, but not with a burn down. There are products that in organic systems that are approved for use in organic production that could, that certainly work as herbicides, but it would not be cost effective, nor would it be wise to apply those in that manner. So as far as approved inputs go, though, they certainly are tools in the toolbox. And there are lots of good ways to find out which ones are a good fit and which ones are approved for use in organic production. So OFA does publish its own approved products list, which we'd be happy to provide to you during transition or to provide to you all who serve as educators and resource providers so that you are aware of what those approved products are. Also, the Organic Materials Review Institute, or OMRI, has a really nice list and a really nice searchable database. I love their website, which also is really clever. It offers the citation that is associated with each product, so you can just read the rule right there. It'll also make it clear whether that product is allowed for sale under, say, the Canadian organic regime or other countries with which we have an organic equivalency agreement, with which the USDA has an equivalency agreement, where there might be slight variations in interpretation or what is allowed. So they would flag that sort of thing on the OMRI site. Also, approved inputs and things that we consider very valuable in organic systems would be manure and compost, which are very widely used. Another question has to do with organic seed. Do I need to use organic seed during transition? Which is a really good question. During the first 2 years of transition, so the first 24 months, untreated non-GMO seed may be used. One would keep one's invoices and records regarding that seed to demonstrate that 36 months of organic management prior to certification. But then the fall, going into the year that you'd be applying for organic certification, so say you'll come out of transition somewhere between May and November the following year, depending on what you're planting or raising. The fall going into that year, the producer that's intending to apply for organic certification would need to at least do a seed search for organic seed, because that will be part of the next year's, that crop or whatever is planted in the fall as a cover crop would be part of that next year's organic inspection. So that seed search would need to take place. The way it's written in the organic standards is to ask if organic seed is commercially available. And the way that that plays out in the industry is, can I get the type of seed that I want in the quantity, quality, and form that I want in organic if I check 3 sources of organic seed. And those have to be sources, obviously, that carry organic seed, make a good faith effort. And then document that search. And if that seed is obtainable in organic form, then one would be obliged to go with the organic seed. If not, then one could use the untreated non-GMO seed, keep documentation, of course, that the search occurred, and then keep the invoices and records noting that that seed is both untreated and non-GMO. A good practice and something that would demonstrate to the certifier that a person was certainly open to utilizing organic seed and wasn't choosing the untreated non-GMO seed just because of cost would be to trial an organic variety, try something similar or new that may not be exactly what you can rely on in terms of, say, a non-GMO variety that you may have been growing for some time, but might be analogous in an organic system, and give it a shot, maybe a bag or 2, and then see how it goes. And then the certifier would note that there was at least an effort being made to try that organic seed. And I suspect, sort of in the broader organic policy arena, I suspect that there will be greater requirements for organic seed over time. So getting involved in using organic seed and trying it out is probably a good practice. This is my favorite question. How big does my buffer need to be? Why is that so fun? That's so fun because you get to get right down to the nitty-gritty of what is happening on the farm. You get to find out right where the fields are and what's going to be grown and what's happening at the neighbors and what are they growing? What's that relationship like between the farmer and the neighbor? And thinking about all those factors. So when you're thinking about your buffer, you're being ruthlessly practical with yourself and examining these aspects of your operation. So what's happening on my farm? What's happening on the neighbor's farm? What are our crop plans for the year? What's our typical rotation? But then also check with the neighbor and make sure that they're following the pattern that they typically follow. When do they usually plant? When do you usually plant? Are your, say you're both growing corn, are your tasseling times going to overlap? Or can you give yourself 3 weeks in between there and make sure that they don't, to try to prevent GE contamination in that way? What's the wind pattern? On our farm, the wind typically comes out of the northwest, occasionally out of the south. Most days it's out of the northwest and it's off of Lake Erie, so it's very windy. You can dry your laundry in no time. But you need to examine these questions about your farm. Think about slope. Think about the way the water flows. What's coming off of the neighbor's land, and could that impact the integrity of your organic crop or your livestock's well-being? Be really common sense and really conservative about it, because this is something that when you're on that inspection, walking through with the inspector, they're going to make a judgment. The inspector is going to make a judgment call about whether or not that buffer is quote unquote adequate to prevent contamination. And you want to fall on the side of that you've done everything you can to try to prevent contamination, even if it's a combination of planting date and a conversation with the neighbor and a buffer. You want to kind of do everything you can do. And if anybody has specific buffer questions, please call me, because I love digging into buffers.
Julia, we had a question on chat that might be appropriate to answer right now. What happens if you take all these precautions and you still get drifted on? And we know there's a few products out there that can travel quite a ways. Right. What steps would you go through? Are you going to have to start back from square one? What are your options there?
Yeah, and that does happen, and it's really unfortunate. And I'm glad that you asked that question. And Cassie, feel free to jump in, because I know you've done a good bit of work on drift as well. My advice would be to just be really transparent and communicative with your certifier, and also call the State Department of Ag and ask for testing, because the certifier will rely on results from testing that they are provided. That's not something that OFA won't run out and come do a sample because drift occurred, but can rely on the test results from the State Department of Ag and work through that issue to try to determine what the next steps are. I wish there was like a really clear rubric that I could provide you. Like if there's dicamba drift, then this happens. It's not that cut and dry. But I'd say just being really transparent and really communicative is the best advice I can give. And Cassie, do you want to share about your pesticide document, drift document?
Yeah, this is a topic I've been working with for the last 2 years. We're getting ready to launch a survey to take a look at how frequently this happens on specialty crops throughout this region. But we did make a nice set of fact sheets, and I can put those in the chat as well, that kind of walk you through, you know, if you think you had pesticide or herbicide drift damage on your farms, you know, what should you do? How do you approach that? You know, and I would encourage people to take that step and call in the State Department and file an official complaint, because what I'm hearing from a lot of people is that there are drift occurrences happening and they're not getting documented. So that means people are like, well, this isn't really a problem, but it is. Some of these products can get caught up in kind of the fog and travel for, I mean, literally for miles. So I guess that's what I'll say on that. And I'll put a link in there to those fact sheets. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Cassie. And thank you for your work on that. The fact sheets are really nice and really concise and clear. The other thing that I'll say is that it's really unfortunate and unfair that the burden of all of this falls on the organic producer, because as Cassie just said, we can't make a 5-mile buffer. We can't control spray techniques that are used by another producer. You know, we all have to go to the training to learn appropriate, you know, best management practices for spray, but it doesn't mean that we can control someone else's behavior. And so I think it's really unfair and really contrary to my understanding of the way this ought to work legally, in terms of the way that it does actually work. But the way that it actually works right now is that the burden is on the back of the organic producer. And that's not right. And we have to continue to work to change that. But it's a really valid question. And I think some of the organic producers on the call could probably share some of their own experiences about how this is played out too at the elevator. So, but maybe for right now, since we've got an hour, I should plug on, and then we'll maybe have some more time for that a little bit later. Good question. Okay, so record keeping, everyone's favorite topic. Okay, I'd like to frame this positively. And I have reframed this in my own mind because the producers have done it for me. They have said, like, you know, Julia, I thought this record keeping was going to be a real pain and really negative, but what I realize is that it's actually made me a better business person. And that I probably should have been doing this record keeping before, but I wasn't because no one was making me. So there's this level of accountability that comes with the organic standards, which is that we can't know what is happening on the farm if we're not there. And so the producer has to be able to account for what happens day to day on the farm and keep that in some sort of record so that it's fully auditable, is the way it's written in the regulations. It must be fully auditable. So I would urge you, if you're thinking about transition or if you're working with transitioning producers, to urge them to utilize that transition period to figure out a record keeping system that will work for you. On our farm, even though my husband is an organic inspector and I do this type of work, we initially started out with a journal system just because that was comfortable for me as a producer, you know, to just come in and write down in journal form what had happened that day on what field. And what we found during our transition was that it was just not auditable. It was just not easy to go back. I mean, it was, but you really had to dig. And we did our first inspection that way, and we just immediately determined that that wasn't going to work for us. So we went to a field by field system for our field activity, which is very auditable and very clear and easy to do. And we've adjusted to it in our brains. And it works really well at inspection. So that would be my recommendation. But lots of people have good digital record keeping systems and hybrids of digital and paper. Because I work on a computer for my job, I did not want to have to boot up the computer every time I came in from the field. So I wanted a paper-based system, but there are certain things like sales, et cetera, that we do digitally. So think about, what might work for you. I know one producer that keeps his record keeping in he has a long dinner table and he has a drawer in it. And before he lets himself eat dinner, he writes down what he did that day, because he just had trouble with it for a few years and he just had to come up with a system of making it part of his daily chores to get it done. So just make it part of your life and get after it. We do have a number of sample record keeping documents on the OFA website, and I'm going to get Cassie a digital handout after this presentation that she'll post or get to you in some form if folks want to submit email addresses, or I don't know, Cassie, what did we decide you were going to post it?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and post it. I don't have everyone's email address. And if you are watching the recording of this or would like to reach out to me, you can probably do that with a quick internet search. But I'm brown1844@osu.edu, and I can certainly get information to you.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, and that will include links to the fact sheets and record keeping documents on OFA's website as well, which are available. They're not required. You don't have to use those specific record keeping documents, but they're available if they're helpful to you. These are just some examples of the different types of record keeping documents that would be important to keep for different types of operations. So field activity is the one that I was just explaining, which I recommend keeping field by field. In a mixed vegetable, diversified vegetable operation, field, and then bed by bed. Storage is really important. If you're, say, a grain operator, what's the capacity of that storage? How full is it? What's your estimate? Some people are able to measure that as it's going in, but others have to estimate based on what they put in there. Sales obviously have to be recorded. If you're selling by the semi-load, that's obviously easier than if you're selling at a farmer's market, but there are ways to do both. CSAs also have creative ways of keeping track of like what was in a share, how many half shares, how many whole shares, and figuring it that way. I've done those audits on inspections and it's very doable. Just has to be written down. Equipment cleaning. I was sharing the combine cleaning story earlier that Dave and I experienced together, but it really depends on the type of equipment. So what are you using on your operation and what's the best way to get it clean? And sometimes that doesn't even really become clear to you until you're doing it for the first time. So we can help you talk through that if you have questions, and OFA does have a policies and procedures document that helps explain the requirements on equipment cleaning. And all of these pieces are important because at that inspection, the inspector can pick any crop or any input, and they can follow it in terms, or any animal, if we're talking livestock operation, and they can follow it in terms of traceability. So from whence it came, the documentation identifying that it was either approved or organic, and then where it went to, and follow that chain on through the operation. And they can also do the math on any crop or livestock product that is produced. So if you grow asparagus and that inspector chooses asparagus, then that inspector needs to be able to see how many row feet of asparagus were planted, how long ago they were planted, how long they've been there to try to estimate yields, and then be able to see them walk out the door in quantities that make sense. And everything in between there, right? How many crowns were purchased if you did a new planting? Not that those would be bearing yet, but you know what I mean? Like, just be able to follow that chain. And if you think about it that way and set yourself up that way, then it ought to be easier to provide that at inspection. Just anything that you grow, you have to be able to follow that logic and do that math, which it's valuable math to be able to do, right? Because it's almost like your own little personal enterprise budget per crop. So it's kind of nice. Okay, another common question: can I do both organic and non-organic production on the same farm? And the answer is yes, of course. We work with many producers who are doing both organic and non-organic production. This slide is from my colleague Ben Bowl at Oregon Tilth. I think he did a really nice job of explaining this using imagery. So he was talking about ways of transitioning when he presented this information. So you can go whole hog and do everything organic at the same time, or you can go a little bit at a time, or you may come to the realization that like some portion of your operation, because of the management of it, will remain conventional, ongoing, or it doesn't make sense fiscally to certify your turkeys, you know, what have you, whatever it is that you're producing, because your market, you know, isn't interested in paying the cost of organic feed or processing or what have you. The organic processor is too far away. It just doesn't, the cost doesn't work out. So whatever it is for you, just kind of going through that thinking in your mind. It does become more complicated when we are talking about split and parallel production. So split production is, let's pretend I grow, well, I do this. I grow organic produce and I raise non-organic beef. And so there's not going to be any confusion between my organic produce and my beef, right? That's not going to happen. Or maybe I raise organic grain and non-organic produce. We're not going to confuse those products. So it's split production. Parallel production is much riskier in the eyes of both the certifier and the inspector. So if you're doing parallel production, expect the ears of the inspector to be, you know, like my cat when she's after a mouse, and expect her to be paying a lot of attention to what's going on in terms of those traceability and mass balance audits, because that has to all really add up very tidily. So if I'm raising organic and non-organic corn, my buffers become really critical. My math on my seed becomes really critical. My storage becomes really critical. You know, my beef is not going to be stored in the same walk-in cooler as my veggies if I'm doing split production. It's just not the same kind of risk. So some folks choose not to do parallel production for that reason, because it can be challenging to demonstrate that level. Even if it's actually happening without a problem, it can be hard to keep really tight enough records to just demonstrate that there's no reason for concern. It's just something to think about. This begs the question often for people, can I raise non-organic livestock on organic land? And the answer is yes, this is absolutely allowed, even with non-organic feed, even with non-organic worming procedures, et cetera. Organic livestock may be raised on organic pastures, or say it's like a pasture hay ground combo, whatever. Also, this begs the question, can non-organic manure be on organic land? And the answer is yes. A great deal of non-organic manure is used on organic farms as an input. The concern is just that it just be manure and bedding, and that there not be additional inputs added to it after the fact. So things like fly spray or hydrated lime for odors, et cetera, would not be allowed to apply to organic ground.
Julia, we have a question on the chat also about some biological products to add to the manure pit. Are there some approved by OMRI? And if not, you know, are there some ways to get around that?
Yes, there are some pit additives that are approved for use in organic production. You just would want to make sure that it's approved before you add it to the pit. And we do have Lou Saunders at OFA, who is our materials review specialist, who can review materials for producers in transition. Lou would be happy to help with that. Or like I said, that OMRI site is very searchable as well if it's a product that would be at the scale where it would be reviewed by OMRI. So the companies have to ask OMRI to review their product, and they have to go through an application process and pay a fee. So not every input producer would be OMRI listed, even if they qualify for use in organic production, or even if the product does. So that's where OFA's review of approved products comes in. Washington State Department of Agriculture also has a nice list. It's not quite as front-facing friendly as OMRI's is, but it is sizable and respected by the community as an authority in terms of what is allowed and not allowed. Well, really, of what is allowed. It's a list of what's allowed. So, good question. One other bit on if you're doing both organic and non-organic production on the same operation, having a standard operating procedure for equipment cleaning is a great time saver. So you write down, you clean it the first time. You call Dave or you call your mentor, you figure out how to clean it. And then you write down what you did. And then from then on, you just initial and date. And you train anybody that works with you who might be cleaning it how to do it. And then they initial and date when they do it. And that really does need to be initialed and dated every time, because that inspector should be looking for that. If, say, that equipment was used on a transitional or on a non-organic field and then on an organic field, like that should be, that should be notated as such, and that should line up with that field activity log. So it's not something that you're going to be able to forget to do, but some people will write up that SOP, that standard operating procedure, have the initial and date, and then just leave it in the truck or leave it in that piece of equipment on a clipboard, and then it's really easy to get the documentation done. Or some folks have like clipboards hanging in the shop, and can just kind of remember to do that. Other things that we talked about that become really important are those buffer zones, and then storing and labeling of inputs separately. And, even if you have, say you have an organic herd, but you raise some non-organic sheep, I don't know, something. You can have the inputs that you would use for your sheep on site and have them there. You can even have emergency antibiotics and things for the cows. They would just be needed to be labeled as such and stored as such. They're not stored in with the homeopathic remedies or the other allowed inputs for herd health in an organic system. They'd be stored separately and noted to be, emergency use only. It's not that they can't be on site. Same goes for products. So like if you have, let's just say you have some organic and non-organic produce and you have a walk-in cooler, maybe you're sharing it for now. You have one side that's your organic side, you have one side that's your non-organic side, and you never store your non-organic produce above your organic produce. You just use really good common sense, and you label it as such so that if you have a helper or an intern or your brother-in-law or whoever, can see it if they walk in the room. It's very clear.
Are all these things required to do during the transition? Or do you just recommend that you do that during the transition to kind of get familiar with it?
I do. You don't want to be setting up these systems your first year of certification if you can help it. There's enough else that goes on that year. So if you can set them up during transition so that it's part of your way of operating and you've already thought through it, that's what I recommend.
But is it required? Are they going to look back and see if you've done these things for like the last 3 years when you go for that?
No, they're not going to look at your equipment cleaning. I mean, in some cases, there's no equipment to clean because everything's transitional, right? But if buffers wouldn't apply because it would all be not certified, right? But it really depends on the specific situation, because sometimes you have one organic field and then you have two, and then maybe eventually there will be three, and they're all on different timelines. But if you're just coming in and it's your very first year, nobody's going to look back at your equipment cleaning records. They're going to look back to see if there were any prohibited substances applied, because you'll provide that 36 months of information as part of your organic system plan. But really during that transition, these are recommendations. What you really have to make sure you do is just none of the deal breakers. So no treated seed, no prohibited substances in the form of inputs, no sewage sludge or radiation of any kind, which would be for a handler. And then you're not even required to keep the records per se, because you could just say like, well, I didn't know for sure that I was going to certify, as long as you can provide the 36 months of the land management. But if there's any question, it would be best to have the records of the seed and the inputs that were used. Does that make sense?
Thanks, Julia. Question? Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, and we're getting to the end of this section too, and we'll have some time to discuss too. Can I certify rented land? Yes, absolutely. Rented land can be certified organic and frequently is. This is where you would utilize that prior land use documentation if you hadn't had it long to demonstrate the 36 months of prior land management. And then I will add, it's really important to have very good open lines of communication with that landowner, because sometimes we've had situations where somebody's renting land, but then the landowner comes out for the weekend, maybe they hunt there, I don't know, whatever, and they, gosh, just decide they'll bring the Roundup and spray that fence line, just get that done. And it can really blow somebody's, certification or organic system plan if there's just some sort of activity like that that takes place. And it can be a real surprise too, which is particularly unfortunate. So it's really important to have that good communication, both within the operation. If you have multiple parties doing the farming, we've had that here just with my father-in-law helping out. And sometimes, gosh, there was this bag of fertilizer, I just thought I'd go ahead and spread it. And it wasn't allowed for use in organic production. And we had to, retransition that ground. So just watching that communication, but particularly with landowners who might not be as well versed. The other point at which it can become difficult with landowners is like an energy infrastructure situation. If there's a pipeline or a cell phone tower or something like that that's going to go in, often the producer doesn't have maybe certainly not the control, but also not the full story of what's happening there. And there are resources available to help protect organic certification that producers can use. Like we have an organic impact mitigation plan that can be used by producers if they know that there may be energy infrastructure development on the farm. But if the producer doesn't know ahead of time, those plans can't be put into place, and that negotiation can't take place between the land manager and the energy company. So sometimes there are ways to satisfy the landowner, the land manager, and the energy company and maintain certification, but the communication lines have to be really open. I have also anecdotally heard in our county, which is not very well populated with organic producers. I'm up in Ashtabula County. We don't have a ton of organic producers here, but I've heard people say that they're actually able to rent the land more readily because they're certified organic. I've also heard that anecdotally down in Southwest Ohio, where the landowners want organic management of the land. So that can sometimes be an advantage. Okay, and we are at the question period, and I'm seeing that we are running behind schedule. So questions about the nuts and bolts, and it's really okay that we're missing that last section because we'll get it in the handout. It's mostly like risk management stuff that you should really better discuss with NRCS and FSA anyway.
One quick question we missed from the chat was, does the initial certification process, okay, that's 3 years before you can sell certified organic products. Does that apply to crops and livestock equally?
Yes. So
Okay.
the 36 months of organic management prior to certification does apply, but there is a 1-year herd transition for dairy cows. So the land would be already in transition. In that last year of transition of the land, the herd can transition along with that last year of transition of the land. We call it T3. So the 3rd year of transition and the herd can come along together. And 3rd year transition feed that is from on farm can be fed to those animals in that 3rd year. And that's the only exception.
Other questions out there? Feel free to take yourself off mute and ask. We covered a lot of ground here. I think I got most of the questions that were put into the chat box, but if you feel like you had one that wasn't addressed.
Yeah, it's just a smart monitor. I'm sorry I missed the answer to part of my question that she just answered. I was watching 2 webinars at the same time. And I guess I'm still wondering about, you might have already answered it, but I didn't hear it, about pesticide drift. If that does happen, do you have to restart the 3-year certification process over again for any affected fields that may have had pesticide drift?
Yeah, potentially. So it's really going to depend on the specific situation. And I was saying before, I'm sorry that there's not a specific rubric that I can give you on the drift, but it will be a judgment call of the certifier. So it was not an intended application, but it may have been an application that occurred unintentionally, even if it was like a dicamba situation, say, that can drift quite or is quite volatile and can settle quite far from the source. So it's not a 100% guaranteed that you'd have to retransition the whole field for another 36 months, but it is a possibility. So my advice was just to stay in really good, close communication with the certifier. As soon as you know something has occurred, take pictures and then call the state for testing. And then Cassie has a really nice fact sheet on that she posted, I think, in the chat. I know that's like probably a less than satisfactory answer.
I know I'd asked you about that before, Julia, and you mentioned, you know, you would look at like what they have in place as far as buffer zones and other precautions, you know, like are they listed with the specialty crop field watch, drift watch program, you know, have they made an effort to prevent this from happening? And that's probably going to go a long way in the decision.
Yeah, it does. I think efforts, you know, and we were just saying it's really unfair. I always get really fired up about this because it's just so unfair that organic producers have to bear the burden of like everybody else's poor decision making. But like, why should my neighbor's business rights and business opportunities preclude my own? Like, that doesn't make sense to my brain. But unfortunately, the way that it plays out currently is that that's the way it's handled, that the organic producer bears the burden. So I can tell you just from a slightly different angle, OFA is required to test 5% of every operation that we certify in a year, or 5% of the operations that we certify every year through something called residue testing. So certain people are trained to go out, they call on the way. So it's kind of a surprise inspection. Sometimes a portion of the operation is inspected and sometimes a sample is just taken of whatever product, and that is sent to a USDA lab and tested for a specific pesticide, herbicide, residues, and other things such as like GMOs in milk or antibiotics in milk, etc. Those cases come back, and when we do have cases where there is residue present of various kinds, we have to then do an investigation to figure out what occurred there. And I can tell you that there have been situations that have not been the fault of the farmer, where the farmer has still had to retransition, like flooding events and such, that have been really unfortunate. There's also been really fluke situations where it was like a bag, one of those woven totes that materials were stored in, and there was a transfer of a residue from the tote. You know, crazy things have happened. So, so they do look into those various specific kind of intent and efforts that were made to make sure things were clean and that contamination would not take place in order to make a decision. And they often have to kick it up to NOP and ask for input, to the National Organic Program and ask for input. So it's just not super cut and dry. It's a process-based standard. So it's supposed to work based on the process. It's not supposed to be a testing-based standard, even though there is a testing procedure in place, both through certification and at the elevator.
Another good question on the chat here. Any advice for a conventional producer, grain producer that's interested in organic, but feels kind of far away from markets and doesn't have an organic elevator or market in the area?
I would kick that one to Dave.
Yep.
This is Lively, member of the OFA Grain Growers chapter and past president of that chapter, long time grain grower mentor to many.
Yeah, to Julia, it's a Great Growers Hotline.
The hotline, my own personal grain grower hotline.
There's all kinds of markets out there. They, I guess I would be cautious to just go with whoever wants to buy your grain. You have a little more control, or try to have a little more control in what you're selling. There are markets here, and try and get it priced at the farm. if you can. That works pretty good. That way they're furnishing trucks that need to be cleaned out and documented. So that's something to consider. Documentation on truck cleanouts too. So it seems like everybody's gotten into the organic buying, middle market broker peoples. So got questions, talk to me.
Yeah, I can give you Dave's direct line. Also, the Grain Growers chapter has an online forum called Organic Talk, which is really nice. If you want to pop your email into the chat, we can pull that out and send you an invite to that group. And that's a great place to post questions with the other grain growers. There's also O-Grain, which is a nice group. They have a listserv, and there are co-ops that collaborate to market organic grains under that umbrella. So there are lots of options for looking into grain markets. But I would start with the grain growers if it were me. The OFA Grain Growers chapter. They're
great meetings.
Yeah, great meetings. Cassie goes, I go sometimes, and you always learn every time. They've done a really good job of staying in touch over Zoom with the pandemic. So we'd be happy to connect you if you pop your information into the chat there.
I think the meeting information is also posted on the OFA website. I'm not 100% sure if it's still up there, but I mean, at every meeting they start out by talking about markets and who sold what and the prices they're getting. It's just, even if you're not 100% sure you want to pursue organic transition, it'd be great for you to pop into a few of those meetings and kind of get a picture of what these guys are getting and dealing with.
Cassie?
Yeah.
I think there is a meeting Saturday, our first meeting. So it'll be our first Zoom meeting of actual meeting. The others have been just kind of connecting with people, but I think there's something on a website through OFA.
See if I
Grain
can.
growers, yeah. So it'd be good to get connected with people, other organic farmers. That'd be your best learning experience.
For sure. Yeah, and my experience with the grain growers especially, but the organic producers in general, is that they all tend to be really willing to teach and share their experience and, you know, kick around ideas. So I wouldn't be shy about getting involved. Everybody culturally, it tends to be a pretty open, pretty friendly group.
Yeah, they let me in.
They let Cassie in. I mean,
any other questions out there? I did not find the meeting information, but I did find contact information for Eli Dean. He's the president of that association, and I just put his phone number in the chat. Great guy, very knowledgeable farmer. Yeah, you're going to pick up a lot of knowledge from great people if you go to one of those meetings. Anything else? Anyone has questions on, comments?
Thanks.
All
Appreciate it.
yeah.
Well, thank you all for coming. We do have another session next week and Wednesday at 11 again, and that'll be on manure analysis. So very, you know, if you're not using manure or composted manure, you should be. So we're going to have Glenn Arnold from Extension in to talk about, you know, what to expect from an analysis and how you can apply that to your fertility program. And lots of other great topics coming up too. So please check that out at goosu.edu/organic series. And thank you so much to Julia for presenting today. It was a great presentation, and hopefully you learned a lot. And, you know, again, I would encourage people to check out OFA. They do a lot of educational programs and have some great resources. We're working on more resources at the offer site as well. That's Ohio State's organic program. So if there's something you'd like to see, please let me know. And we will have all the links and hopefully Julie posted along with the recording on that go.osu.edu/organic series website. So check that out, hopefully by tomorrow.
Great, thank you. And I'll just add for the producer with the question about the on-farm readiness reviews, I'll include several links to resources in that digital handout that Cassie will be posting. We have a transition guide and workbook that both offer and OSU, or both offer and OFA have worked on over time, which is a nice resource. And then other transitional services that I'll link to on there. I'm sorry I didn't get to that piece of the talk, but we'll just, we'll get it to you in the form of a handout.
I see one question we missed, and I think, yeah, Angela is still on the call here. Is there random soil testing done to check for pre-emergent herbicides? And I don't think there is, but I'll let you answer that.
There is not, and that's like the most common question that was asked by my family when I was getting into organic production and organic certification. People wanted to know if there was soil testing done to determine if there had been historical use of herbicides, and there is not. There's some data that shows that certain types of herbicides are not sticking around in the soil in such a way that they would be showing up. So I don't know that it would be all that illuminating if there were. But it is a process-based standard, so we do require sort of that 36 months of documentation and of self-attestation, or other landowner, other land manager attestation that the practices that are required occurred. And then the part that would be really, really difficult to fake would be that ongoing daily activity. You'd have to spend an awful lot of your time trying to do a convincing job of faking that. So the system doesn't always work quickly when there is fraud taking place, but in my experience, it does work.
All right. Anyone else? Thank you. Thanks to everyone for hanging out with us a little past our scheduled ending time. So I hope you got something out of this, and I hope you can join us for some other seminars in the future.
Thank you, Cassie.